give you a quick overview on soldering the board that you have. You can see I've already started with a few things that I've been placing. The easiest thing to start with are the resistors. The resistors are in your kit, should be labeled. So I'm going to put in another 10K. The nice thing about the resistors is that there is no polarity, meaning there's no positive and negative end. Either end can go either way. The resistors are color coded, and you can look online how to calculate what the resistor value is. But in our kit, we've put a little piece of paper, a little piece of tape that indicates what it is. So here I've got a 10K, and you'll notice on the board it has a little indication of where 10K goes. So what I'll do is I'll just put this through the holes here. Get the wires through the hole. Then I'll push it down, and then I'll bend the wires on the back side of the board so that it stays in place. Now I've done the same thing with this LED. Let me put another LED in. This is our high-end LED. LEDs are polarized, meaning they have a positive and a negative side. If you set them up backwards, they won't work. So with an LED, the short leg is always negative. And if you see on your little thing on the board, it'll have a flat spot on the indication of the LED. And the negative goes where that flat spot is. If you look really carefully, there's a flat spot on the edge of the base of the LED as well. So that's what that's indicating. So the long one goes through the positive hole, flat one goes to the flat hole. And just like what I did with the resistors, I will bend the legs of this LED over so that the LED stays in place. Because then what I'm going to do is flip the board over and start soldering. Now let me do a quick how-to with soldering. First thing is, the solder that you choose, make sure that you use something that is 40% lead. I know we hear about lead being the worst thing in the world and all that, so do it in a well-ventilated area. The other thing is, your soldering iron should be set at about 350 to 400 degrees. That's just a rule of thumb that'll keep it from, baking out any of these components. Okay, I'm going to flip it really quick, and then I'll show you quickly how to solder the back sides of these. Okay, now we're flipped around. You can see the back side. I apologize, the air conditioner's on. Now we're going to solder, but it's very important for your soldering iron. If you have a smaller tip, that's a good idea. I like to have something to clean the tip in. I just stick the tip. Often the less expensive things will come with a sponge or something like that. Do not touch any of the metal in front of that. It will burn. Okay, now the thing I'd like to point out is each one of these components that have the leads are what we call wires. So the leads are coming through, and if you look carefully, you'll see a little metal ring in the board around those wires. That metal ring is called the pad, and we want to make sure to heat up the metal before we apply the solder. So we want to take our soldering iron, and I'm going to start with this green LED over here. I'm going to put the soldering iron right there on the metal and the wire coming through. Then, after a few seconds, I'm going to touch my solder to the tip, and you're going to hold it for a second and then let go. And what will happen is it'll fill in that little area with solder, and you'll have a nice silver solder joint. Now I'm going to do it again on the one just above it. Hold it, wait a second or two, wait till the solder will melt. I've had too much caffeine. And lift it. Now that LED is soldered in. You see these are hard or firmly in there. Another tool that you're going to need toward the end of this is these little nippers. These are usually only $1 or $2 a piece. You can buy them. They're a little more expensive on Amazon. They may be $4 to $5. And what these are for is to go through after you solder something up, you can just snip off. Oops, keep turning this. Bend these out a little. You can snip the leads off. I've got them upside down this way. Relatively flush so they don't stick through as much and they can't interfere with each other. If I just left these leads like that, you can see they would short each other out. Make sure that we're still in frame here. Yes. Okay. So, again, I'm going to do the upper LED now. I'm going to, and you don't have to cut off the leads at the very end of each one. You can leave the leads on until they get in the way. Touch it with both the pad and the wire. The solder's going to melt. Now, solder will flow toward the hot metal. So if you heat up the base metal enough, that's the idea. You want to heat the component enough that the solder flows onto it and onto the pad of the board that you're trying to connect it to. 1, 2, 3. There, it's soldered on. That's all it is. Now I'm going to go through and do some of these resistors that we put in. Same thing. Touch it. There it goes. And then out. Touch it. Hold it for a few seconds. Add the solder. And done. It's also very important to have a solder with a flux core. Flux keeps, essentially, if you can imagine on a microscopic level, it rusting. When you apply heat, it wants to kind of rust and form a little layer of rust in between your joint. Now that will keep it from being a good solid solder joint. Okay, now I got to bend this one out of the way. Touch that, hold it. Give it a couple of seconds, boom, done. Move this one up out of the way. I've soldered all these. Now you don't need an expensive soldering iron. This one cost me, I think, $6, something like that. And now all of my LEDs and I think most of these are in place. Done. So I'll come back. I'm going to zip through and solder up a few more of these things, and then I'll go to some other components and we'll talk about how to solder those. Okay, we're back. So I'm going to show you a couple of things that actually have polarity. So as you can see, I put in the rest of the LEDs and the rest of the resistors. So those are all taken care of. They're all soldered in. Now we're going to do a couple other components. Some are really easy and some are a little bit more difficult only because they have polarity, and I'll show you how that works. So the first one, we've got our little button. This just has two legs. It does not have polarity, so we just put this in the set button area. So that slides right in like that. Now you can see it's loose, and I don't want this to fall out. So I'm going to hold it in place, and I'm going to bend those legs over on the back side so it's nice and relatively firmly in there. It's not going to fall out because, again, we're going to flip this over and solder it from the back side. The next thing that's really easy is our little 10K pot. Now, this is the one with the twist that you need the screwdriver for. If you look, the signal level pot has two legs and a third up top. And here we have two legs and a third. So all we do is we pop this through. Now the nice thing about this particular component is that it actually kind of springs itself into place. So if I can line this up, pardon my hands in the way, then I push it through, it'll kind of pop in and hold itself in place so I don't have to bend anything on the back side. Now, two components that do have polarity are things called capacitors. Now here, if you look really closely, you can see 2.2 UF and 10 UF. And if we look really close at this capacitor. Let me see if I can get this in focus at all for you. Probably not. But on the side, right here, it says 10 UF. So there's my 10 UF. Now in this one, you can see there's a dark line on the one side with one hole, and then the other one has a positive. Now, just the same as the LEDs. It's a system. The short leg goes toward negative. So here's the positive. That's the negative. The negative also has the darker colors. So if I put the long leg through the positive. Oh, and the other thing is, on the capacitor itself, you'll see a little gray band that has negatives on it. So that's how you know the capacitor, but also you'll have the leg difference. So the short leg is always negative, long leg is always positive. I had too much caffeine, so I can't even get this through. Sorry, excuse my hands in the way. So there, push that through and do the same thing that I did with everything else. I just want to bend the legs out of the way. So now it's relatively firmly in place. The next one is this little capacitor. This one says 2.2 UF on the side. I don't know if you can see that. It's also got the negatives and that like kind of gray or white band. This one is slightly different because we don't have a positive, but we have a light colored side and a darker colored side. The darker colored side in this case is the negative. So I put my long leg through the lighter color, the shorter leg through the negative side, and then I reach to the back. I hold it firmly down on the board and I bend those legs so I get it in place. Okay? So now I'm going to flip this over and we're going to see. Take the solder, take the soldering iron, do the same system. So this is the button that I did. I'm going to hold it on the button. I'm touching the wire and that pad for a few seconds to get it nice and heated up. Touch the solder to it. The solder will flow right around it. Did you see how I had too much solder all over the tip of my gun or my soldering iron? That's something you don't really want, so I cleaned it off. Now you can see I've got a nice clean tip again. You see how it's covering the entire pad? These you can't see quite as easily, but this one you clearly can, and that one. So you want the solder to cover the whole pad if you can. So you really want to heat that pad up as well and make sure that you do that. Two, three, lift off. You see that's nice, bright, shiny color, and it's coloring that entire pad. Something else that should go without saying, but I don't want to bridge anything with solder. So if I have solder going from this pad to that pad, that's not good. Apply more heat to that bridge and make that bridge go away, because that'll obviously short out the. I know it's kind of difficult to see on the video, but you can actually see the solder flow into the solder joint. If you're having real difficulty getting the solder to flow like that, maybe make sure that your soldering iron is heating up properly and up to the right temperature. It's got to be around 350 degrees or higher for this solder to flow very well. The other thing is maybe change your perspective. If you look down at the side of it, it should look kind of like a melted pyramid when the solder is properly put in. Also, the component itself, you'll feel it, it'll be solidly held in place. It won't move around or jiggle around like you saw they were doing before I soldered them in. Now they're all solidly in there. Okay, we're back. So I've soldered in a few other things, nipped them off, all that stuff. So now I'm going to show you a few components that are kind of, in their own way, not that easy to do, and it's a really easy solution. The solution is sticky tape. So, for example, we've got our little auxiliary earphone jack, the speaker jack. And you can see it's got a whole bunch of pins on the bottom, and they match up perfectly with the holes in this. But the problem is, once I set that in place, let me get it into place, make sure none of the pins are bent or anything. Now it's in place. That's great. It stays in place. But if I flip that over, it's going to fall out. There's no way to bend those pins. I'll show you another example. Are these barrel connectors. There's 3 pins here. They go through those 3 corresponding holes, but that's it. There's nothing that I can hold it in place with. So the answer, as I mentioned, is just plain old ordinary tape. The easiest way to do this, stick that thing through, stick a piece of tape over it. Let's stick this one through, stick a piece of tape over it. Let me move this tape out of the way because I want to show you something else. And that is our little KA2284. That's one of the chips that helps our animatronic to talk. Now, if you look at this chip, and if you look at where it goes, see there's the area labeled. Let me find a pointer. Here we go. I use the label is KA2284. That's the component. And if you look over at the one side of this, do you see that little black triangle? That corresponds with, if you look at the chip, it's relatively unremarkable. It's just got a bunch of legs sticking out and a flat kind of rectangular shape. But if you look at one edge of that, there's that little 45-degree cutaway. That 45-degree cutaway goes with, this is important, that little triangle. So this side is squared off. This side has a 45. I simply line up all these legs and stick it through. Now again, I have another issue where there's nothing holding this in. I can't bend those legs on the other side. So again, my old friend sticky tape, I hold it, push it through, hold it in place, kind of where I want it, nice and straight up and down, and then stick the tape down as best I can, all the way around that. That'll hold it in place when I remove these now and flip it over. Keep in mind, you don't have to have a setup like a bunch of extra hands and whatnot. You can actually do this on a tabletop. The extra hands just makes it a little easier. Things tend to hold kind of where I want them. Also, it holds it in front of the camera a little easier. So there you go. Now, if you look carefully, you can see all the legs from those components sticking through. Now I have to put the tip right in there and then just bring the solder in. Now, I wanted to show you something particular about these screw terminals. You should have 4 of the little 2 terminals and 1 3 terminal. The only thing, and this is really dumb, of course, they don't have polarity either. And the terminals that you'll be using should go toward the outside. So just make sure that the metal parts that you're going to be putting the wires into go toward the outside when you place them into place. And the other thing is, just when you do place them, it doesn't matter if they're perfectly lined up or anything. You can actually bend them into place, whatever component, like for example these, you can straighten up and bend into place. So I'm going to go ahead and do some more components very quickly and solder those up. Then I'm going to show you the pins, which are these, and then putting in the sockets, which are these 2. Okay, we're back. So now we're going to do some of these headers. Now I've done a couple. I put in the setup headers already. But you see I have this little 3 header here for the jumper, for the power jumper. And then I've got this brick of headers that's going to go in the servo position. Now, again, headers don't have any orientation or anything like that. But you will notice that the little black plastic is further down, so the part that points up on the top of the board should be these long headers, and you want to put the short ones through the holes. So I'm going to put this block through the hole like that. Now again, we have the same problem that we had with some of the other components. The headers won't stay in place. So I'm going to use my friend's sticky tape. Now you can also use things like sticky tack, like blue tack and things like that to stick these in. I just happen to have tape laying around, so that's what I tend to use. And you can push that down, try to get it on some areas of the board. Now I'm doing this one as well, so I've got to get to this guy somehow. And push it down as best you can to stick it to whatever you can on the board without creating too much of a problem. That should be all right. Now I'm going to flip it over, and again, I'm going to go through and do them all. Now, the daunting one is, of course, this one with the 15. Probably speed it up, but I'll show you how I go about doing it. It's relatively easy. Incidentally, if you have problems and you notice the solder just isn't going fast into your joint, it should take a second or two to solder this. From when you put the soldering tip to the plate and the lead coming through, you should be able to flow solder into that joint within about a second or two, maybe 3 or 4. If it takes more than 5 or 6 seconds, chances are your soldering iron is too cold. So make sure it's somewhere around 350 degrees and make sure that it gets at least that hot. Incidentally, the 350 degrees that I'm talking about is centigrade, 350 C, not 350 Fahrenheit. Fahrenheit, that would be closer to about 700 degrees, 800, somewhere in there, like 780 or something. So just make sure that your soldering iron is hot enough for your solder. That's why the 60-40 solder works very, very well to flow into those joints very nicely. And I'll show you at the very end how we check to make sure all our solders are good. Okay, framing is good. So we'll probably speed it up and solder up these things. Here's my 3, and I'll show you in normal time about how long it should take. You'll notice my soldering iron is set to about 380, and it flows right in. There you go, that 3 one is done. Now, okay, now for our last 2 components that we have to solder on. With these, we're doing sockets. So this is for the Arduino and for our DF Nano. Now, just to clarify, and this is important for your setup and everything else. So the Arduino obviously have 15 legs. The DF Nano has 8 legs on each side. So for the Arduino, we want to line these up. Let me see if I can get this in view. And slide those pins into place so it's in. You may find that it's a little bit narrow side to side or something like that. If it is, you can just give it a little bend. Now the thing about the Arduino, we connect with the Arduino using a USB. So the USB will go with that little rectangle, and you want the Arduino to be facing that way, the USB port going outward. That's going to be, it's not important while we're soldering it together, but it will be very important when you're doing your setup. So just good practice. Now you're going to put all of these feet through these holes. It takes a little bit of doing. And once it sits in place, oftentimes there will be a little tension and it'll hold it in place. This one is not. These are nice and straight from the factory. So I'm going to put some tape over it the same way that I normally do. This one, same thing. How do we put the SD card in? You'll see the little SD card slot. That will go out in the DF player slot. So again, we want to put our little feet through the holes, assuming I can see them. Got one in. Sometimes it takes a little jostling and jiggling. Eventually you'll get them both in. Now I'm going to use my sticky tape again and tape these things down as best I can. Try to get them held in place. Okay, after you get it all in place and flipped over, you may want to give the Arduino and the DF player a little nudge to push it up through and make sure that the feet are sticking up through nice and evenly. The nice thing is after you get one of these soldered in place, you don't have to worry about it anymore. It'll be stuck. So again, I'm going to check the temperature on my soldering iron, and generally speaking, the Arduino is a little harder because there's 15 on each side. There's 30 legs. So I usually start from the inside and work my way this way, inside, work my way this way. They're nice and horizontal, so I usually put the board horizontally so I can ride along the top like that with my soldering iron. Let me show you how this goes. Okay, there you go. We're all set. So the last thing that I like to do after I solder these all up and have everything all done, I usually let it cool a little more so I don't burn myself. Peel off all your tape, and then, this is important, to tilt it so that you're looking right across the board and look at each one of those solder joints, and they should look like little pyramids that go up to the little stick. If you see some that you don't like, this one doesn't look quite good enough. So the next thing I'll do, I'm going to stick this back on here so you guys can see it. Before I turn off my soldering iron or anything, I didn't like that one, so I'm going to give it a little bit more heat and just make sure that it's nice and tidy. Make sure that all of your Arduino connections are good. All of your DF player connections are good, and if they are, terrific. Congratulations, you're done. It really doesn't take that much time. I'd say all told, this entire project, really, if I'm not shooting a video, takes me about maybe 20 minutes to have a talking skull board. There you go.
Oh, I didn't mean to frighten you prematurely.